Hello, everybody. This is Abnormal Psychology, and this is the first video for subject material. We're going to talk about what is abnormal psychology, okay? And the first thing we're going to do is talk about what we will talk about. We're going to talk about a number of things. This is the introductory material, really. Classification, diagnosis, assessment. Then we're going to jump into anxiety disorders. And you've seen the list on the syllabus, so I won't go through all of this, but we're going to cover many of the major categories, and I've selected out certain disorders to discuss. But there are hundreds that we could discuss, so I've had to make a judgment about what we will and won't cover. I think you're going to enjoy what we do cover. Okay, so I'm going to move this around. And there we go. Okay. So there are a number of things we won't cover. We won't cover, for example, neurodevelopmental disorders. I cover those in developmental psychology. We won't cover sexual dysfunctions. I cover that in human sexuality. Paraphilic disorders, same thing, human sexuality. We won't cover many of the childhood disorders, such as feeding and eating disorders and elimination disorders, and we won't cover any sleep-wake disorders. We cover that in intro. Gender dysphoria, cover that in human sexuality. Disruptive and conduct disorders, developmental, substance abuse, that's intro. Addictive disorders, intro. Intro to counseling, I cover legal and ethical issues. Research methods, I cover that in intro and developmental. This is not a treatment course. Counseling is a treatment course. So those are the things we won't cover, okay? All right. Now, I want you to be aware of something that often happens when you study biological or psychological disorders. I don't really want to distinguish those from each other because in some respects they're interwoven, aren't they? But beware of the medical student syndrome. And the medical student syndrome is about the way in which your mind plays tricks on you when you study things that have symptoms attached to them. Medical students are notorious for, when studying, say, cancer of one kind or another, that they begin to wonder if they have that disorder. And this is very true of courses in abnormal psychology, where you are actually thinking that you have what you're studying. And the chances are you don't. But of course, if you have a question about whether you have something, bounce it off me, or talk to the counselor, somebody at the counseling center. Okay, yeah, probably you don't. Okay, all behaviors originate from multiple sources. All behaviors have multiple purposes. We are all products of our genetic heritage and the unleashing of the potential that we have genetically. We are all possessive of a different sort of personality with overlaps. We are more similar than different, but certainly we have uniqueness, each of us. All disorders have elements of early learning, of genetics, of experiences, and the way in which we contribute to our development. We're going to talk a lot about diagnosis and how you do it. That is an artful science, okay? So be very cautious that you learn the science associated with diagnosis and not rely entirely or even substantially on intuition, though your intuition will be informed by experience, okay? All right. This course could be called a lot of different things. It could be called psychopathology. It could just be called abnormal psychology. It's just an area of psychology that's devoted to the study of non-typical behavior. Okay? And so the goal of this area of study is to describe, explain, predict, and to change abnormal patterns of functioning. That's what it's for, okay? It's not, the study itself is not devoted to the treatment of such disorders, but what we want to do as clinical clinical providers is we want to then add in on top of that we want to use this information to offer effective treatment for people. Okay? Now, psychiatrists offer medical treatment. We offer psychological treatment in the counseling world. Okay? All right. Have you ever heard the term, of course you have, the term nuts and loony and crazy and wild and deviant and senile and mental breakdown, emotional breakdown? Most of those terms have pejorative implications. Insane, crazy, nuts, loony, those are all very pejorative. Those are all very negative terms. They don't really have any meaning whatsoever in psychology. The term deviant has a statistical meaning. It has an implication of being out of the norm. It also has an implication of antisocial behavior or in some ways sexual behavior that is outside of the norm and criminal. So it has a number of non-specific meanings, and then it has a meaning in statistics, meaning out of the norm. Emotional and mental breakdown, those are phrases used by people who are trying to imply maybe that I've got some noise here, that if the person has decompensated, which is the appropriate term in psychology, they cannot cope with the stress that they are under, and so they are not functioning at the moment. That's what that means. And senility is an old term. It's not a term we use anymore, really. And it has to do with losing cognitive ability associated with age. But we really don't use it anymore. Okay, so what do we got here? Okay. So what fields study this kind of material, this abnormal psychology or psychopathology? Well, psychology does. Medicine does in terms of treatment using medical means. Usually we're talking about medications. Sociology, how things exist in other cultures and that's also about anthropology, but in terms of how society impacts the expression of abnormal conditions. And then the history of abnormal psychology and its treatment. And then criminal justice, of course, has an overlap with this. A fair percentage of people beyond the general population who are incarcerated have bona fide psychological disorders. Okay. Who treats mental disorders? Well, clinical psychologists, counseling psychologists, psychiatrists, and master-level counselors, which include licensed professional counselors, licensed alcohol and drug counselors, clinical social workers, and so on. Yeah, but all of these people are licensed. And most psychologists, although they are probably either more likely to be clinical and then to a lesser extent counseling psychologists, those are people with PhDs, there are lots of other kinds of psychologists who are not treatment specialists. Developmental psychologists are an example. School psychologists, another example. Okay, general psychologists. They have PhDs, so they're called psychologists, but they're not treatment specialists. Now, here are some myths about, and we'll cover that in the next video. Okay, all right.